In January next year, Trump will be sworn in and become the U.S. president. But the U.S. China Trade War 2.0 appears to be already underway. On November 19th, the U.S. China Economic and Security Review Commission, USCC, a body under Congress, officially recommended for the first time in its annual report that the Congress revoke China's Permanent Normal Trade Relations (PNTR) status, widely known in China as the Most Favored Nation treatment. In the past 2 years, many members of the U.S. Senate and House have made similar appeals, including Florida Senator Marco Rubio, who is set to become Secretary of State. Rubio's prominent anti-communist stance even landed him on the Chinese Communist Party's sanctions blacklist. Now, with Trump elected as U.S. President and Rubio about to assume the role of Secretary of State, Trump's proposal to impose tariffs exceeding 60% on all Chinese goods appears to signal a move toward revoke China's Most Favored Nation status. Most Favored Nation (MFN) status represents the most favorable trade relationship, with the countries benefiting from lower tariffs. For instance, the average tariffs the U.S. applies to nations with MFN status is about 2.2%. Prior to Trump's first trade war in early 2018, the tariff rate on Chinese goods exported to the U.S. was just 2.3%. However, after the trade war initiated by Trump and the subsequent 4 years under Biden, this average tariff rate has risen to approximately 20%. Despite this, 52% of Chinese goods exported to the U.S. still enjoy MFN tariffs, meaning the U.S. has only raised the tariffs on 48% of Chinese products. Currently, there is increasing domestic pressure in the U.S. to revoke China's Most Favored Nation status, especially since Trump has explicitly stated his plan to impose tariffs on all Chinese goods. As a result, it appears that China's MFN status is likely to be cancelled. In response to this pressure, Wang Shouwen, China's Vice Minister of Commerce and Chief Trade Negotiator, recently spoke out. Domestically, he assured that the Ministry of Commerce has already put in place measures to help Chinese business navigate the trade tensions, stressing that China has the capacity to resolve the trade conflicts with the U.S. He also pointed out that if the U.S. raises tariffs, the ultimate burden will fall on American consumers. Internationally, Wang conveyed that China is open to constructive dialogue with the U.S. to manage their differences. Meanwhile, China's central bank stepped in to stabilize the economy, likely in anticipation of a potential depreciation of the yuan. The bank affirmed that the yuan's exchange rate will remain broadly stable and promised to prevent excessive fluctuations. Hi, I'm Dongxiang and welcome to Dig Into China, where we explore China in depth to uncover unique insights. In this episode, we'll analyze whether China's Most Favored Nation status in the US is truly at the risk of being revoked. First, let's explain what it means for the US to impose tariffs on China. Many of you may not be familiar with the foreign trade industry, so it's important to understand how these tariffs could impact both American and Chinese people. Here's a fact. If you walk into a Walmart in the US, you will notice many products made in China, but their prices aren't exactly low. For instance, a small toy made in China might be priced at $10 in Walmart, while the import cost from China is only $1. This doesn't mean Walmart is pocketing a $9 profit. That's not the case. If you check Walmart's financial reports, you will see that their profit margin are actually quite slim, usually just a few percentage points. For instance, if Walmart imports a small toy from China for $1, the additional costs for shipping, storage, logistics, insurance, and in-store expenses can add up to $8. So when Walmart sells the toy for $10, it's only making a $1 profit. If the US imposes a 60% tariffs on all goods imported from China, let's assume, for the sake of argument, that the entire tariff is absorbed by the importer. In that case, Walmart's cost for importing a toy from China would rise from $1 to $1.60. Let's assume Walmart passes the entire cost increase onto the consumer. In that case, the toy's price in the US would rise to $10.60, which means a 6% price increase. But would this 6% hike really have a significant impact on American consumers? Not really. Even if the prices of imported goods go up, the effect on the U.S. Consumer Price Index would likely be minimal, likely only a small fraction of a percent. If during this process oil prices in the US drop and Walmart's transportation and storage costs decrease, Walmart may not need to raise price by the full 6%. Therefore, a 60% tariffs on Chinese imports might not be as detrimental to American consumers as it first appears. Of course, we are using Walmart as an example because it reflects the spending habits of average American consumers, and the toys are the second largest category of Chinese exports to the US. However, for other everyday goods that Americans need, like clothing and footwear, the supply chain has already shifted to Southeast Asia. As we've worked out, the Chinese Ministry of Commerce's statement that the tariffs will ultimately be paid by American consumers doesn't really carry much weight in terms of causing fear. Therefore, the US will not face a major burden in revoking China's most favored nation status. As we've seen, even if all the tariffs are passed on to American consumers, the price increase wouldn't be drastic. In fact, if the US Treasury reduced its issuance of bonds and the government cut back on spending, this small inflation could be offset. Therefore, I believe the revocation of China's most favored nation status is almost certain. There is no need to wait for Trump's approval. Once Rubio becomes the Secretary of State, he will likely be quick to push this forward. For China, however, the pressure from higher tariffs is much greater. Take the toy trade, for example. Walmart used to import a toy from China for $1. But with the price now rising to $1.60 due to the tariffs, Walmart might look to other sources. They could, for instance, find a supplier in Mexico where the toy costs only $1.50. Since Mexico is closer to the US, the shipping costs are lower, and Walmart may shift its orders from China to Mexico. As a result, the Chinese exporters could lose customers. If they can't find alternative markets or shift to domestic sales, they may struggle to keep their businesses afloat. However, there is one exception. China can only justify raising prices if Walmart can't find the toys anywhere else in the world except China. But clearly, China doesn't have that kind of a monopoly, and that's one of the challenges it faces. In recent years, China has been focusing on technological innovation and industrial reform, ultimately aiming to gain control over product pricing. The goal is for China to say, if only I have it, I can raise prices whenever I want, and if you don't buy, others will. Xi Jinping dreams of having that kind of power one day. But while dreams are fine, reality must still be confronted. Since China doesn't have that kind of leverage, it faces two clear options for its export trade. One is to back down to the US, reduce prices, and maintain access to the American market. The other is to seek new export opportunities and fully shift away from the US market. In my opinion, China is trying to pursue both of these paths at the same time. For example, in the first approach of conceding to the US, the Ministry of Commerce has made it clear that it wants to negotiate. And as Xi Jinping has said, cooperation benefits both sides, signaling that China doesn't want a trade war with the US. Beijing has also made several attempts to reach out to Trump in hopes of easing tensions. In fact, Xi Jinping might be better off trying to win favor with Trump's newly appointed Treasury Secretary Bessent. He strongly opposes the Democrats' reckless spending and supports free trade. He's against imposing a 60% tariffs on China and prefers using a tariffs as a negotiating tool or increasing them gradually. His views align closely with those of Musk. So this Treasury Secretary might actually be able to help China, but his support for free trade has its boundaries. Essentially, if the U.S.-China trade relationship were to threaten Americans' free trade principles, he would take a tough approach. So the best outcome for this U.S.-China trade war would be for China to finally play by the rules. China shouldn't take advantage of the fact that it has gained influence within the WTO to continue stealing technology and engaging in dumping practices. After all, if other countries start leaving the WTO and China is the only one remaining, the organization loses its relevance. If China doesn't offer enough sincerity to the US and continues trying to be crafty, the U.S. China Trade War 2.0 won't have a good resolution. China also has a second option to boost trade with countries outside the US and lessen its reliance on the American market. Recently, China announced unilateral visa exemptions for Japan and 8 other countries. Key US allies such as Australia, New Zealand, Japan, South Korea, and the European Union have become targets for China's efforts to strengthen trade ties. This strategy is clearly aimed at splitting the US allies and enhancing trade relationships with these countries to reduce the risks of losing access to the American market. China's recent move to grant visa exemptions to Japan has triggered a backlash among nationalists, with many little pinks feeling betrayed. It's evident that the strain from the trade war has pushed China into this position, as it somewhat undermines its previous stance. This marks the second time in recent months that the nationalist fervor has backfired, following Pelosi's Taiwan visit. However, whether Japan, a close ally of the US, will align with China's efforts is still unclear. After all, when China floods other countries with exports, it often meets resistance. What these countries actually prefer is investment. But China's financial resources are no longer as abundant as before. Some may wonder why China recently issued $2 billion in sovereign debt to Saudi Arabia. Previously, China mainly issued US dollar bonds in Hong Kong, so this move to Saudi Arabia stands out. It's seen as an attempt by China to challenge the dominance of the petrodollar, using the US dollar to secure more dollars in return. It's not as complicated as it seems. Issuing bonds is essentially borrowing money. When China issued bonds in Saudi Arabia, they essentially borrowed $2 billion. The key point is who the lenders are. Of that $2 billion, 68% came from Asia, which suggests that China might be backing these investors. In contrast, the Middle Eastern investors only contributed about 8%, or just over $100 million. So it seems that Saudi Arabia may not be as optimistic about China as some assume. In the past, when the Chinese government issued bonds in Hong Kong, it was essentially Beijing borrowing money from Hong Kong. Since Hong Kong had already been handed back to China, the borrowing process was quite straightforward. Hong Kong had little choice but to lend, and that's how it went. So, why borrow money from Saudi Arabia this time? It's mainly because of the strong partnership between the two countries. Saudi Arabia has been investing in China recently, and China remains Saudi's largest oil buyer, creating a mutually beneficial relationship. Issuing US dollar bonds overseas has both advantages and drawbacks. The primary benefit is that it allows China to attract foreign investment, which is crucial for the country at the moment. However, the downside is the high cost of borrowing in dollars. For example, the bonds China issued in Saudi Arabia carry an interest rate of 4.28% for 3-year bonds and 4.34% for 5-year bonds, which is relatively expensive. Moreover, when borrowing in US dollars, the repayment must also be in dollars. If a country takes on too much foreign debt, its credit rating could drop, leading to higher borrowing costs in the future. This creates a negative feedback loop. So issuing more bonds overseas isn't always advantageous. It's like taking a loan from a bank. If you borrow 1 million yuan at a 4% interest, you need to earn at least 4% return every year for the loan to be worthwhile. Similarly, with an interest rate of over 4% on the $2 billion loan China took from Saudi Arabia, it means that unless this $2 billion investment generates a return of more than 4% annually, the borrowing will result in a loss. Given China's current GDP growth rate, this borrowing cost seems quite high. Hong Kong is different. Since it's part of China, borrowing from there is essentially risk-free. China can simply issue new bonds to roll over the debt, making it effectively perpetual. But with Saudi Arabia, a foreign nation, there is no guarantee they will continue lending when the debt matures. At these high interest rates, there is a real risk that the borrowed money could end up costing China more than it earns. The key reason I'm not optimistic about China's position in this trade war is that its financial resources have already been depleted. To build stronger trade relations with the U.S. allies and other countries, China needs to offer incentives. Without offering something in return, why would these countries open their markets to China? The EU has been quite savvy in this approach, urging China to set up factories within its borders, offering access to the European market in exchange for contributing to local taxes and employment. However, all of this requires heavy investment, funds that come from China's dwindling foreign exchange reserves, which are a crucial part of its economic stability. Even if Chinese factories are moved to the EU, can they still maintain the same competitive advantage? The likely outcome is that these factories would bring in illegal workers from China, which would lead to hefty fines from the EU, a region that prides itself on human rights standards. Ultimately, these factories could face closure unless China invests heavily to secure influence with EU officials. The democratic nature of these countries means that the citizens could elect right-wing leaders who would shut down these factories for not adhering to the rules. China is caught in a difficult situation. It must invest abroad to gain access to foreign markets while simultaneously depending on its domestic factories to generate foreign exchange. This back and forth could lead to a scenario where spending exceeds earnings. Additionally, as manufacturing continues to move overseas, unemployment at home rises, contributing to social unrest. The Communist Party, reluctant to allocate funds to soothe public discontent, risks facing both domestic challenges and external pressures. I don't see any real chance of China winning this trade war. Don't be misled by the Ministry of Commerce and the central bank. They are just speaking for political reasons. The renminbi will inevitably weaken because a 7.3 exchange rate is unsustainable. When the central bank talks about firmly defending the exchange rates, it's clear that their confidence is lacking. We heard the same rhetoric back in 2018 during the first trade war with the US, but in the end, the renminbi depreciated as expected. So we should just take those words with a grain of salt. Thank you so much for watching. If you find this video helpful, please like it, drop a comment below, and hit the subscribe button right here. It really helps YouTube suggest my video to others. I'll be back with more content soon. Until then, be well.